Hello and welcome to Dixon Cox with me, Nick Dixon, and Paul Cox, the show where we'd rather be far right than far wrong. I didn't warn Paul that was the new slogan. I just thought of that now,
No
and
idea.
I just thought that would be great. If you say something in a sort of BBC Sounds radio podcast voice, no one can touch it. The show where we'd rather be far right than far right. You know what I mean? It just sounds comforting if you say it like that. And coming up, Paul Cox will be talking about his dislike for immigrants. That's at 5. You know what I mean? Just what they can't touch you because you said it in that
It's the
voice.
tone. It's the
It's the
tone.
tone.
It works. I just
Yeah.
didn't know you were going to say it. That's the element of surprise about that joke.
Yes, I kept it. I kept that one close, but of course, it's a joke, guys. We're moderates. It's a moderate centrist podcast. Welcome to the Centrist Dads podcast with me, Nick Dixon, and Paul Cox, where we do a little bit of banter, but not too much because the people on YouTube get too angry. So we're going to go straight into it because we've got so many stories. How are you doing first, by the way, Paul, though, just
I'm
quickly?
okay, thanks. I'm okay, thanks, Nick. You know, there's something. I've left my blind open this time. There's a big discussion going on air, but you know, it's spring. Let's enjoy it. Let's embrace it. I hope everyone's enjoying their spring.
Let's enjoy Paul's slightly worse picture. Actually, your picture looks better than mine, and you've got all the stuff in the background, which for some reason I've not managed to have. And you're looking very, very slim as well, Paul, I have to say.
Yeah, lost over 3 stone now.
That Ozempic kicking in. You'll be sponsoring it soon.
Don't start that because everyone
I'm
keeps
Paul
asking.
Cox. You might have heard about Ozempic. You'll be just releasing your own dodgy Ozempic.
Yeah, a Zempox. No, it's not a Zempic. I'm just eating less, and I've been doing it for about 5 months. So it's like gradual. Just people are starting to notice now. Loudly.
I want to see that advert. You may have noticed I've been a lot slimmer lately. How have I done it? It's called eating less. It's just the advert is just like, stop stuffing your face, you fat bastard. I'm applying it to me as well, by the way, because I'm very much overweight and trying to work on it.
Well, this is the thing. He's not really, because we've worked out that we're roughly the same weight. In fact, Nick's a little bit less than me, but it's. I look thinner because, and I don't look thinner than Nick, but I look thinner.
I think you do.
My comparison, because I was fat, actually fat.
Maybe you are thinner and you're still slightly heavier because you've got that working class strength you kept talking about. These weird bones that are sort of denser than the sun. And you can just...
to help me lift stuff into my mid to old age.
Yes. We'll turn it into a competition. That'll be good. That'll encourage me. Who can lose the most weight in a crash fashion quickest?
Let's not do that. That's not good.
You reminded me I'm actually hungry now doing this, and I'm not even sure I can get through a whole podcast. Let's crack on before one of us passes out due to low calories. I thought we'd kick off with this sentencing guidelines, and this is we're recording this on what was being called Two-Tier Tuesday, because it was the day that Britain was going to bring in apartheid laws, because we all know that white men and Christians and so on are discriminated against in this country, but it was about to become official in the sentencing guidelines, but it has now been quashed by Labour. And many people say it was always going to be quashed, and that could be fair enough. Some people even say, it's just it's just a bit of theatre. The media drum this up and Labour get to look cool. I can understand that argument. I'm not sure that's actually how it's happened, though, because I think it probably is the stubbornness of the Sentencing Council. So this Sentencing Council, which is just some quango, decided we were going to consider whether people were of an ethnic minority, cultural minority, and or faith minority community, transgender, young or female. So if you showed up and you were, I don't know, you were Muslim or something, or a trans person, whatever, they consider it and give you a different sentence. Whereas if poor old Paul showed up, the people's gammon, straight in the slammer for you, mate. And that was going to be the system, but it's now been overturned. But the sentencing council had a chance to overturn it. They didn't. They were being very cocky until Shabana Mahmood, the Justice Secretary, said she was going to bring this emergency legislation. In actual fact, it probably wouldn't pass for a while, but she's threatened she is bringing it in, and therefore that would make the guidance unlawful. And therefore the Sentencing Council has backed off, basically, and said, we won't do this absolutely insane idea that would have overturned our entire legal history, our entire Christian basis for our law, and would have just brought in this absurd communism, which was really equity, really equality of outcome in terms of sentencing. Because the idea is, well, hang on, some black people go to jail more, and it may be that judges are sort of making these judgments and using perhaps they are being using a sort of some sort of prejudice in their mind. We don't know. That's been looked into, and the Labour say they'll look into that more. But you can't rig it so that you end up with the same number of people in jail. And as Robert Jenrick pointed out, Hindus and Sikhs are less likely to go to jail. So then you'd end up putting more of them in jail to get it completely even, guys. Much like the kind of Harvard admissions where you ended up with Asian people not getting in, not just white people. We know we always get attacked, but Asian people as well because they were basically too smart. So these are the absurdities of a communist legal system. Paul, what was your take?
Oh man,
your take
this is very revealing. Honestly,
this country.
This is very, very revealing of our time. So much so that we've got Keir Starmer fighting it. And I'll get back to that in a minute. But the reason it's revealing is because we've gone so far down the progressive road that we now think in order to balance out racism, what we need is more racism. And we've got heavily funded quangos who are in agreement with this and also have the power, it would seem, to usurp the Justice Secretary for at least a period of time. This feels like a bit of a victory for Mahmood, and she has said all along that she would fight this, and she doesn't believe in a two-tier system, and that this would create a two-tier system. But tell me this: how on earth can we get ourselves to a point where this is actually a legitimate policy in what was the first civilized country in the world? We introduced civilization. In the modern world, we introduced civilization. And we are now at a point where we are saying that we will, first of all, judge someone based on their crime. We will then halt for a bit, and pre-sentencing will go away and look at the colour of their skin, their ethnicity, their sexuality, their minority status, and we will sentence them based on that. That is not a justice system. That is not justice. There's no equality in that whatsoever. The idea that you would end up with prisons that essentially matched society, which is what they've tried to do with all big corporate businesses through DEI. If you ever sat in one of these DEI lessons, what they're saying, you work in London, for instance, in an office in London for a corporate, you sit down in these lessons, in these training sessions, and they will say, what we're trying to make this business look like out there is to represent, everything that we see on the streets of London. That's not how it works. That's not meritocracy. If that's the case, you end up with basketball teams with dwarfs and little people in it. That's not what it's about, But there are certain things that need to be left alone, and the law and justice is one of them. I have been actually and genuinely quite terrified by how quickly this is snowballed, to the point that, like you say, today was going to be Two-Tier Tuesday, and it's taken Keir Starmer, the one person who would absolutely relish this type of thing, to actually stop and go, I don't think this is a good idea. And they're struggling still because they say, well, we need to look at certain things and we need to look at that. Look, if there are more young black men in prison than anybody else, let's say, proportionally speaking, let's look at why that is. Let's genuinely look at why that is. Are more crimes being committed? Is there prejudice inbuilt in the system? People are screaming at this going no or yes or whatever. But let's actually find out. Everything's anecdotal. Everything's what you hear on Radio 4 or the BBC. No one's actually saying this is the statistics. And every time you're presented with statistics and you look at it, you find out they've been provided by another quango who is entirely funded to make sure the statistics look that way. So I'm genuinely worried by how this has been able to manifest, and that enough adults in the room have considered it a good idea. Genuine grown-ups have considered this a good idea. It's a catastrophe. It's a travesty for our justice system. It's a travesty for us, for the UK as a whole. And we really, really need to look at this. Now, if you're on the left side of this argument, you could look at this and go, well, actually, it's not that bad. It's just trying to balance things out. You don't balance out the outcome of justice. That's not what you try and do. You try and prevent crime, and then when crimes are committed, everybody's trialed and tried without fear or favour. It's not with minority status taken into consideration, because where does that end? And like you say, effectively what it does is it says he's a white straight man, sling him in the slammer. That's not justice. That's not justice whatsoever, Nick. I mean, honestly, I'm aghast at how this has happened.
That's why I call it apartheid, because it's to get across the severity, because everyone's sort of saying, oh, this is silly or out of control or blah, blah. Really, that's what it is. Why not take away our vote or give us half a vote? Why not stop us drinking at water fountains? I mean, why should a straight white man, for example, even pay taxes or pay the same taxes once it's written into law that he is treated as a lesser person? So yeah, but then it was never really going to happen. You sort of felt they were always going to stop it. Whether they stopped it because of the media pressure, whether I don't know. You can go as conspiratorial as you like, but it felt like it was never really going to go through to the point where, as you say, even Starmer had to do something, because when you're called two-tier Kia, the absolute last thing you want is the clear two-tier laws put in. I mean, but the people who put these things in, one, they don't understand. Well, they don't care about they don't seem to understand the country or its history. They don't seem to understand much, but they certainly don't understand politics. So the judiciary, the kind of people that coming up with this, the quango that comes up with it, they don't care about any of that, and they don't care how bad it looks for Labour, of course. But they also don't care about civil unrest, apparently, or the backlash from this, which you're just pushing people further and further towards a just intolerable situation. It's already pretty horrific in this country, and then you just push them. Imagine this was brought in. Imagine, and also, obviously, what Labour will be scared about politically is you hand an easy win to Reform. Whatever we say about Reform, they're basically a Liberal Party. They're very, very soft, in my opinion, but they would have an absolute open goal with this one. It's so with the Tories. I mean, Jenrick's been the best on this, to be honest. So it's a big open goal for them, and Labour had to fix it, and so now they have. So now they get to look like they're doing something. There are something, and of course we know it's not just this; it's the ECHR in general. These legal bodies just seem to be incredibly arrogant. I mean, the fact that this was raised and they just stuck with it, like, no, we're going through with this. It's not up to you. And this guy behind it, Lord Justice William Davis, wrote a series of sort of boring letters explaining why it was necessary. And he wasn't going to shift. In the end, he backed out because he pretty much had to, because it would have become unlawful if the legislation had gone through to counter it, or when it does go through, it will become unlawful. So he just backed out, but it was really disgusting arrogance. There are some things you want to take into account. I think pregnant women is one. If you're the sole carer for a child is another one I've heard that seems perfectly reasonable. There are some things where you go, yeah, okay, if this is going to destroy the child's life, maybe we can look at that, because we have to look at the child's life in the way that people refuse to with abortion, who are very pro-choice. But we have to look at the child's life. But in any other case, it's complete nonsense. And when you say racism, yeah, is it racism or is it just pattern recognition? If certain people are committing more crimes, maybe a judge, the question is, do they sentence them more harshly and give more custodial sentences, is the claim, for the same crime? But imagine you're an individual judge. You've dealt with the same thing a lot of times. It depends on how the individual presents themselves and conducts themselves in court. There's a number of factors that might go into it, where you might go, yeah, this guy is worse. And you can't prove that that's racism, and no one has. It's just how it is, isn't it? And yes, it's absurd. Anyway, so there we are. The attempt to get equity in terms of sentencing out is one of the most stupid, communist, deranged things.
It's dangerous. It's truly dangerous. It undermines the principles of Western society, of a democratic, law-abiding Western society. If you start smashing away at that baseline, who knows where you end up? And we know with other stuff when it comes to the trans debate and where that's led us into some pretty dark alleys, because it's just been left unchecked and people have been allowed to push their propaganda, their progressivism as far as they like, and it's ended up affecting people in a very negative way. And that would just be a small, minute problem by comparison to undermining our justice system in this way. We shouldn't underestimate how dangerous this is. We shouldn't forget the people that pushed for it either. And I'm not suggesting they should all be singled out and taken into a room and punished at all. But what we should understand Yeah.
The guy
So
behind
am I
this
think.
should what he should face some sort of punishment to come up with this. You should face some sort of punishment. I mean, you should at very least be sacked. That whole Quango needs to go. Really, I think the guy
Yeah.
needs to have some sort of. He needs to have something for this. Go on.
So Quangos are funded by taxpayer money largely. They're funded by donations. They're funded by various routes and often by political parties. You wouldn't be surprised. It wouldn't surprise me if that particular Quango is funded quite heavily by this Labour government. It's certainly in keeping with the type of ultra progressivism that Labour and Keir Starmer are very much interested in. Some would argue that Keir Starmer's not as progressive as they would like him to be, but trust me, if this is not far enough, I don't know what is. This is unbelievable.
But he's certainly very
I'm
sort of lefty human rights lawyer, isn't he? So this is for him to go against this is sort of going against his ethos in a way. He's always going around the world trying to let off various monsters off the death penalty, or he used to do that. Probably too busy now. But he's obsessed with. He's Mr. Human Rights lawyer, and it's always to the left. So this is a sort of departure for him. But I guess there are some things that are too insane or look too bad even for Starmer. Anyway, sorry, go on.
no problem whatsoever. And that's the telling thing. That's why I started with it at the top. Even Keir Starmer, who has got a track record of essentially showing disdain for large majority groups in this country in order to win votes. And I don't think that's too strong a statement. I think that a lot of Labour's policy has been anti-white, and they've done it to appease the pro-Muslim constituents in a lot of their constituencies. And I'm not that this isn't an argument. This particular argument isn't about whites versus Muslims. Okay, now a lot of people would be afraid to even enter into that debate because that's seen as very, very dangerous debate territory that could get you in a serious amount of problems. But we have seen it in the general election in Wes Streeting's constituency. That it was he squeaked through, and Labour know that there are a number of constituencies across the Midlands that they could lose to independent MPs on the basis that those independent MPs are of cultural alignment, quite often Muslims themselves, to their constituents. And we'll cover this perhaps in other stories. But for me, this is much more about the appeasement aspect of Labour policy, or not even Labour policy, woke, left-wing, ultra-progressive, neo-socialism policy that aims to strike at the heart of establishment, and establishment being the white, straight male, and in some cases female, but largely the white, straight male. And, I'm not making that a victim group. But it would have created a victim group had this gone through, which would have been a political and optical disaster for Labour, because everybody else would have been able to point at that. Because whilst I talk about these constituencies full of immigrants, first, second, third, fourth generation immigrants, lots of them born in this country, no issue with that whatsoever. A lot of those constituents are still majority white working class as well, from which the Labour movement was born, by the way. For which, the reason we have a Labour movement is because of the white working classes. And it feels to me that they've been abandoned at every turn. And this might seem like a tenuous stretch to correlate this particular issue with the justice issue, but it's not at all. It's not at all. The abandonment of the white man in Great Britain is something that I think will be held up in history as something that is quite abhorrent. And I don't think it's too much to say so. I think that it's a dangerous ideology to pit people's colour of their skin against one another. And that's not what I'm doing, by the way. I'm not saying Muslims bad, white good. What I'm saying is you, by the way, the left, the progressive left, you are the one that has demarcated. You are the one that has created silos. You are the ones that have divided. And as such, we now measure everything against these groups. And there's no choice. And we've got to the point where we've built actual justice policy based on it. If we have a problem with too many minorities of one kind committing crimes, let's find out why. Are they being targeted by the police? Because I can't believe they are now. Because we see our police dancing around, pride flags, bending the knee. These people are terrified to do anything that's anti or racist in any way. So I just cannot believe now. I'm not saying it's not there. I'm not saying there's an old school, old guard element that could be considered racist and might not be as progressive as people would like. But I cannot believe in 2025 that we have many metropolitan type police forces that are in any way prejudicing against black or Muslim or brown or Asian people at all. I just can't, because we've got ourselves to a point where that doesn't seem possible. I could be wrong, but I'm quite passionate about this because it's very dangerous.
There's a lot of the opposite, as you say. There's the community leaders. Are we allowed to do some police this week in the Muslim communities and so on? Yeah, it's absurd. But what this is white men themselves. You're saying it's against the sort of white majority, which of course it is. But it's white men themselves. This guy, this Justice William Davis. I mean, he's a white bloke. Obviously, they bought into the ideology of sort of postmodern leftism, whatever it is. Is it, or you could say it's rooted in liberalism, this sort of Rousseauian idea of the criminal somehow as a victim. We see it all the time with the ECHR. Oh, your kid doesn't like chicken nuggets, so you can't be deported. You're an alcoholic, paedophile, so you can't be deported because they're against alcoholism in your country and against alcohol. That was a real example. Constant examples like this. It puts the criminal as the real victim, which is an extraordinary thing for the legal system to be doing, but that's what it does. And then if they have other characteristics, then that's all added to that. It's like, oh, not only are you a criminal, you're an ethnic minority criminal, where you must be the best person then in the world. You must be the one we protect the most. And that's how we get this system of narco tyranny that we have. It's extraordinary. They've all imbibed this ideology, and it goes all the way through the civil service. And this is the central disaster. People talk about woke, but it's just so much deeper than that. There's all those silly examples of woke we see all the time, but this is the deep woke that has taken over our entire legal system, our entire civil service, and that's how to get rid of that is the real thing. It's a total revolution in thinking. It's the long march through the institutions. Peter Hitchens talks about it an awful lot. There was one other element we didn't mention, which is ethnic minority suspects given priority for bail. So even while this was going on, the Ministry of Justice themselves, and Jemmicks pointing out this hypocrisy, were coming up with this idea that you should take into account someone's background when it comes to whether you give them bail. So how crazy is that? So ethnic minority criminal suspects are being given priority by judges considering bail under new two-tier justice guidelines drawn up by the Ministry of Justice. Judges and magistrates have been told they should prioritize the cases of ethnic minorities, women, and transgender suspects because they may be at disproportionately higher risk of being remanded into custody. So it's the same thing again, but with regards to bail, and it's actually coming from the Ministry of Justice in this case. So even as they're fighting the sentencing guidelines, they need to get their own house in order, is the accusation. So, Labour. Robert Jemmicks says, he's currently Shadow Justice Secretary, by the way. I talk about him as if it's obvious because he almost became Tory leader and is the obvious choice, but he's currently in the Shadow Justice role. He said Labour tried to hoodwink the public that they oppose two-tier justice, but this proves they're peddling it from bail through to sentencing. Two-tier Keiris presiding over a justice system determined to treat ethnic minorities more leniently. Did you notice that one, Paul? That's just an extra little...
Yeah, and he is. The embarrassing thing about this for Keir Starmer is everybody became aware. There is lots of policy that have gone through under Labour that we just do not know the detail about. Okay? Be under no illusion. There are other policies out there that we just don't know. And this is not just a Labour thing. This is whoever. So much of the devil is in the detail, okay, without trying to be too cliche. So we don't know unless all of us sit down collectively. And by the way, that's what the government is supposed to be doing on our behalf, is protecting us on our behalf. They're not supposed to bring in ideology into this, but of course it's politics, so it's absolutely filled to the brim with ideology now. They are, unless we all sit down and go over this policy or any policy that's being introduced with a fine-tooth comb, or we have excellent journalism that people are allowed to scrutinise without being considered racist and without the police knocking on their door, and can do actual journalism on our behalf, this stuff is going to go through on a more regular basis, because there is so much ideology woven into policy now, whether it be net zero, zealotry, or whether it be anti-racism, racism, as we're seeing with this justice bill, then it's, unless we are allowed to scrutinise it, or unless, as I believe to be true, journalists or even people at our level of journalism who are able to scrutinise from a right-wing perspective without being criticised, and more that's being able to be done. But we're not listening to, if you and I were sat here with Owen Jones now, this would be a huge row because we wouldn't agree on it. And ultimately, we are three people that would be hugely impacted by this bill. Owen Jones might consider himself, because he's a gay white man, that he's okay and he's got a history, he's got 1 million followers who think he's progressive. But trust me, that's not going to be in the pre-sentencing. The pre-sentencing is going to say white privileged man. He is going to be in trouble.
The gay
with
bit
the rest
might be
of us.
in there. Would the gay bit be in there? Would he get slightly
Potentially. But look, let's face it, this isn't 20 years ago. Being gay now is not a minority.
But
You're
the judge
gay,
would look
Nick,
at Owen
I'm
Jones.
gay. Leo Kearse is 100% gay.
That's a big problem, yeah. Yeah, he is.
So-
But Owen Jones, the judge would look at him and say he's gay, he's quite small, how is he going to fare in prison, in the showers? And I think he would factor that in.
You and I we're not going to fare any better.
You'll be all right, Paul. It'll just be like your council state.
I'll start talking like I might do if I went back to see some old school friends, just getting in there.
You'd be everyone's mate. You wouldn't have to even beat up anyone. You'd just be like going between them, sorting out the cigarette deals and stuff. Like, you know what I mean? Like this is what I see you doing. You'd be like, he needs some cigarettes, and everyone would know they could come to you. So I suppose you would have to you'd maybe have to fight maybe one person just to show you could.
Yeah, just to show there'd have to be a fight set up for me to win, maybe over an extra sausage in the canteen. And I managed to sort of get them in a bit of a half Nelson, knee them in the face, and they go down. And I say, "Look, here's some snuff. Lay down there, pretend you got beaten up." In my mind, you and I are in a porridge-like situation, and you're the clever one who is writing to the girlfriends of the stupid inmates. So they're coming to you, going, "Nick, there's loads of long words in here, mate." And then you say, "No, they're not actually long words.
Yes.
Don't worry about it. They're just actual words." And then you help them write to their girlfriend, and they sort out, how they're going to name their fourth child.
You're right. That would be my best chance. Would be helping with the letters, helping with their cases, doing all the homework. Can you write this for me? You're right. That's I would default to that.
And I'd be a conduit as well, because they're like, these guys know it. You wouldn't know it, but Nick and Paul actually know each other. What mega hard coxie knows Dixon. Yeah. It's just it's a long story, but they once worked together on a deal outside of prison. We wouldn't fare well, mate, and I don't think any of our listeners think that we would. I don't want to go to prison. This is, again, why I don't like this policy. I'm not likely to do anything. This has always been my... prison's a fear for me. I used to have reoccurring nightmares that I went to prison. The idea that I was in prison, that put me off all sorts of things. What's happening now that's different to when I was younger, I'm much less likely to commit an actual crime, but I say a lot of things.
Yeah.
And those things could get me in trouble. I am considered relatively moderate on the right of politics.
On this podcast.
Criticised to some degree by our more stronger right-leaning listeners, and all views are welcome, for not being right enough, and maybe you not pushing back enough, and me not being a foil enough. All these things, right? However, I've already said things today that could get me in a lot of trouble if I said it on BBC Radio, for instance. So it's that type of thing that can see you in prison. Maybe even go back to Southport. I hate evoking Southport because it's the same as evoking Adolf Hitler in an argument. Southport put people in prison for 3 years for doing stuff that they would have got a 6-week sentence for, okay? One of them committed suicide as a result. And we have seen since then people from a different background, or people who pleaded not guilty and actually decided to run the gauntlet with the justice system, getting either off, or in the case of being maybe an ethnic minority, getting a much, much lighter sentence. Hence two-tier care. This is not made up. We're not exaggerating it. I know there are people that follow me on the left of politics, particularly on my Facebook page, who think that I am absolutely mental for thinking that there is any form of two-tier justice. Well, there is. There really is. I can point out, as I have done 3 or 4 cases where that's been the case. The trouble is when you do it, people are like, oh, one does protest too much. No, one doesn't. There is a worrying thing. So I'm slightly worried. I wouldn't say it keeps me awake at night. I'm slightly worried that I could fall foul of this and find myself. You could fall foul of this, Nick. We are
more than you, yeah.
We are at pains when we're doing this, and especially when we're doing headliners, to make sure we don't get ourselves into trouble. We've got Ofcom to protect us. It protects us as well as the left. It does. And on it does in the sense that if we understand the rules of the game, we can play to the rules of the game. So everybody. So there is some equilibrium there. Whereas we don't agree, and there are things that we don't say on air that go against that. I've been in a room where you've been told you can't say certain things that are totally acceptable and against your principles, the core principles by which you abide, yet you cannot say it, or you might be in trouble,
Really?
or you better say the opposite.
I think I would probably say it. Well, I've certainly said things that have got me in trouble and been punished for it. But I don't recall. I don't think I'd ever not say something. You certainly have to say it in a cleverer way.
Yeah. So
Ofcom certainly. In Ofcom, I don't think it is fair in any way. And there aren't clear rules. Suddenly, Jacob Rees-Mogg's in trouble for going to breaking news for 9 seconds. Although they actually won that one in the end, it was overturned by a judge. Ofcom lost, but I think it's an absurd protean system, Ofcom. So I don't think it's fair in any way, or that you can even stay within the guidelines because they're shifting. I just think it's nonsense. So I don't know.
You stay within the guidelines largely by towing the progressive line, or alluding to that. I'm not going to say too much because it's tricky. We are comedians. You're an ex-comedian.
I'm
You're a very funny
man.
Who are asked to comment on the news, and we're right-leaning, certainly by today's Overton window, right-leaning. And being funny and on the right is tricky. You just don't have... There's not the elasticity that you have when you're on the left. The things that we can poke fun at are scrutinised more. Simple as that. There's no one watching or listening to this, particularly this far into the programme, that would deny that. And, we abide by those rules to keep our job, to keep GB News on the air. When we do this, however, this is all unfiltered. We know things that we probably shouldn't say to make sure that it just doesn't get taken down and not seen by anybody. And I may have trodden over that line a couple of times today. I don't know. Neither do I care, because the whole point of Dixon Cox is what you have sort of entertaining discussion and debate about the things that we're passionate about, and that's exactly what we're doing. But going back
very
to
modest, Paul. You need to get way more out there. Remember, Louis Schaefer on the show said Hitler did a lot of nice things. You can't be totally against the guy, so that's the standard. He got away with that, so you need to be saying a lot more, Paul.
Yeah, I just don't want to. Lewis is an enigma, and I'm never going to polarize people in the same way Lewis does. No, neither do I want to. But these policies will sneak through all sorts of nasties. We've aligned, like on net zero, for instance, because of Ed Miliband and because of this Labour government under Keir Starmer, we've aligned ourselves to the EU on net zero on a whole raft of things. That means that every version change on the EU's zealotry net zero policies, the UK are aligned to in some way, because we've agreed to do this, to do another deal on something else. This sort of stuff goes on all the time, and it's part of the bureaucracy that goes on in the background. And okay, it happens, and you get the policies of the government of the day. So if it was a Conservative government, you'd get the Conservative policies. Although what we saw for at least the last, I don't know how many years, let's say all 14 of them, we barely got a Conservative policy in many cases. We've probably seen Keir Starmer talk more conservatively than the Conservative Party did, which is why we've become so disappointed in what's happening with reform at the moment, because it was the one opportunity to give an option to the electorate. that some of us might just be able to align with. And they've even managed, it feels at the moment, to mess that up to some degree. But anyway, look, this policy was potentially very dangerous. It looks like it's been thwarted. I don't think it is completely over. The biggest problem is, how does a Quango like this exist? How does a Quango like this have the power? And how does it get to this point, Nick?
Yeah, it's got to go. But that's even Jenrick was being a bit coy about that. But here's another one that's absolutely crazy. This WhatsApp story. So you may have seen that this couple had a visit from 6 uniformed police, I believe. This was Maxie Allen, who complained to his daughter's primary school about the recruitment process for a new head teacher. And so 6 uniformed officers from Hertfordshire Police came to his house. Their criticisms included disparaging comments on a parent's WhatsApp group, and him and his wife were detained in front of their young daughter before being fingerprinted, searched, and left in a police cell for 8 hours. They were questioned on suspicion of harassment, malicious communications, and causing nuisance on school property. After a 5-week investigation, police concluded there should be no further action. The couple had been previously banned from entering Cowley Hill Primary School. So they were a bit sort of maybe they were pushy parents, but they were just basically saying this is nonsense, whatever. How did you get recruited? And they were asking some questions, but it was all just completely normal stuff, but not in our country anymore, because they got a visit from the police for this. Absolutely incredible. They describe it as Kafkaesque because, of course, very much like the Alison Pearson story, they weren't allowed to know what the communications were. So, and there's an update on this today. Police chief defends arrests of parents in school WhatsApp row. So, Andy Profit, strangely he's called, is the chief constable, and he's defended it, but he said maybe they didn't need to be quite as heavy-handed. So he said, I've looked at the footage. I understand why a member of the public would look at that and think that feels a bit over the top. With the benefit of hindsight, I think we could have done and should have done that differently. We may have needed 6 people. They didn't need to all be uniformed officers. We didn't need to have 3 marked vehicles and a police van parked outside. We probably could have achieved it with 1 or 2 uniformed officers. I mean, it's incredible. He still goes on to say if we needed people to go in, we could have thought about officers in plain clothes. He's still saying, we basically did the right thing. Maybe didn't need to have a whole SWAT team outside. I mean, this is as sick as it gets in our anarcho-tyranny world. I mean, very much like the Alison Pearson case that was famous, if you missed it, where a journalist had some people from Essex police for no reason. This one is particularly shocking. I mean, it's parents. It's a primary school. The police come to your door. Why? Because the school doesn't like what you said. And so it's really beyond parody, and you can't really exaggerate how bad this is and how disgusting it is to be happening in this country. I mean, it's pure anarcho-tyranny. Anyone who's part of this should be deeply ashamed because they're part of dragging our country down to, Soviet Union levels, maybe even current Russia, where you can end up in jail for a long time. China, there's all these examples. We all know how these systems work and how countries can fall apart. And if you're part of this, if you're a police officer visiting the house, I think you should reassess your life, maybe do a different job. Whoever's ordering this needs to be sacked and probably in jail. I'm so disgusted with this kind of thing because it's just so obviously wrong. And it's part of this anarcho-tyranny I'm always talking about, whereby, coined by Samuel Francis in the early 90s, whereby, as I'm sure you'll know, criminals are let off lightly and the innocent are punished. It's the two factors, the anarcho and the tyranny. And I'll just give you an example of that. This prisoner was released early by Labour and killed a man on the same day, which was Liam Matthews. He got out and stabbed the bloke immediately. And he was one of the people let out because, of course, they needed to free up room for the political prisoners over Southport, which was the purest example of anarcho-tyranny. You put people in jail for posting on Facebook, you put some grannies in jail for that, and then you release violent people who kill someone immediately. And it's the purest example of anarcho-tyranny. It's beyond exaggeration. This is where we are. And this WhatsApp thing is another appalling example. Paul.
So, oh man, I feel your rage. This is like Dixon Cox get angry. This episode is, I'm just full of rage about this stuff. On the day I shared the Ring video footage, which I think you did as well, Nick, everyone did to some degree. And I just said, okay, now is the time to panic. This is utterly deranged. And I mean it. what you see is 6 police officers, all the vehicles that you described, turning up to a suburban house in which resides parents and a 9-year-old girl. These parents, by their own admission, are awkward and maybe don't go along with everybody else in the group. And I can imagine in these groups, they create awkward situations by challenging certain things. Nothing wrong with that. It's uncomfortable if you're in there as a parent, potentially uncomfortable if you're the school, but there is nothing wrong with that. And before, 5 weeks to investigate this. And by the way, much like with Alison Pearson, they never actually said what it is the parents said that caused any problem. Not one thing. So what you can do with this, by the way, what is a massively disgusting overreach of authority. And that's the terrifying thing. That's the 1984 stuff. It's a massive overreach. So what they can do in this situation is nobody is to be told what they're investigating, but you can go and arrest parents in front of their 9-year-old daughter and take them away and put them in a jail cell for 8 hours without telling them what they have done. That is not cool, because that means that at no point it can be challenged. You can't say, well, hang on a minute, tell me what I said. Maybe I was out of order, maybe I wasn't. Let's have a debate about the context here. None of that. None of that whatsoever. So this is local authority, local schools who are, by the way, make no mistake, the people that work in these places, more often than not in local authorities, are mini Hitlers, genuinely mini Hitlers. I've had jobs in the past, right, where I've had to work with local authorities, and they are full to the brim of people that have been desperate to get some power in their lives, and this is the way that they've found it. And they've used it to their advantage for their own gain. And that's what's happened in this. Somebody doesn't like what somebody has said, so they have instructed our police force to go and arrest them and interview them about what was written in a WhatsApp group. And by the way, both the parents have come back and said, we've not, we are disruptive in the sense that we're awkward. They've not denied that. But at no point have they broken any sort of code of conduct, used any sort of inflammatory language, or been racist or abused anybody. You can challenge things. You know what it's like with schools. You went to a school. Rules can be infuriating, and the way things are run can be really, really infuriating, and you want to challenge it because more often than not, in the name of fairness, they're doing things that are incredibly unfair. And what it takes within these groups, and I'm not that person very often, but it always takes that Karen, for the want of a better term, that challenges it, that when it comes up means that at least somebody is challenging it in some way. Now, we might gossip amongst ourselves and say she's a right pain in the arse, that one. I wish she wouldn't do this every time. Why can't we just have a straightforward debate? But there's nothing wrong with it. It's not a criminal offence. And we're finding ourselves in a position now where it is so authoritarian that it only serves to quiet people down. So 90% of people reading this story will think, I'm not going to say anything. I wasn't going to say anything anyway, and I'm never going to say anything now. Or I might have said something, and I'm definitely not going to now. And even the people that would have been outspoken, some of those now will think, I could do without that. That is very traumatic for that 9-year-old girl. That is something that she lives with for the rest of her school life, without a doubt. Because everybody in that school knows it was her. Everybody in that school knows it was her parents. And nobody in that school, maybe with the exception of the people that instructed the arrest, know what was said. So there could be a whole bunch of things in that group, but nobody knows exactly what triggered the arrest.
But also, it was traumatic for the parents because they thought their daughter was dead when the police arrived at the house. So imagine that. Incredibly,
right? Incredibly. And obviously, I'm motivizing it by focusing in on the child because it's not easy being a police officer. I couldn't do it. They're absolute scum. No, they're not. But I couldn't do it, okay?
There's some good ones I do want to say because some of our fans are police officers or former police officers, and they do a very, very tough job. but it's the politicized ones. It's the politicization of the organization. We all know we're not attacking the individual cop who has to
Exactly.
do a hard job.
So there would have been people in that group of 6 who must have felt some level of embarrassment about that.
I'm certain.
And you know what? If there wasn't, I'm even more worried and maybe even more angry than I was when I started talking about this a few minutes ago, because I want those police officers to question it. This is all stemmed from people being uncomfortable with people having the ability to express free speech online. This is where it's come from. Social media. We've struggled to come to terms with the fact that not only do people have an endless supply of opinions, they now have a platform so big that they can tell the world about it. And of course, that undermines all sorts of things. And in some cases, it's a flipping nightmare. Okay, national security, stuff like that. Criminal cases where you want that nonce to go to prison, but somebody speaks out online and it causes a problem. There are times where it's necessary for people just to watch what they say for the greater good. But in general, and on the whole, people sharing their opinions, or hurty words, as we like to say, isn't as big what we should be concentrating on in situations like this is educating people to be able to sort the wheat from the chaff, educating people to be critical thinkers. Let people talk. I want to hear what people have got to say, irrespective of whether I agree with them or not, so that I can use my own critical thinking and make a decision based on my experience of life. And then if someone doesn't agree with me and it upsets me, well, more fool me. It's not the world's problem. And what we've done is we've taken that situation and we've criminalized it so that parents talking in a school WhatsApp group can be arrested in front of their 9-year-old daughter. It's a very short leap. And where does it go from there? All you do is you stop people saying the things you don't want them to say. And nobody wants to live in that society. I don't want to live in that. I don't want to stop people who've got all sorts of woke horse shit coming out their mouth from saying what they say. I'd much rather hear it and have the debate. So I could not be more against this. There's no crime being committed, clearly, but the crime that's now been committed is against those parents and that child. Simple as that. Where's their comeback, Nick? That's what I want to know. What can they do now? Absolutely sod all, mate. That's what they can do.
Yeah, just because of time, we've got so much to get through. What about this related case? So it's Trump team monitoring anti-abortion free speech case in the UK. So this is interesting. This is the case of Livia Tosici Bolt. Quite a hard name to say. Is that an Italian name? Someone can help me out. She's a retired medical scientist who was arrested last year, 64 years old, charged with infringing a public spaces protection order after holding a sign reading "Here to Talk" near an abortion facility in Bournemouth, which breached a designated buffer zone. Which, if you're not from Britain, these are these absurd zones that stop you even praying in your head near an abortion clinic. And in Britain, even it's a hard topic to even get anyone to care about, because even on the alleged conservative side, people are so rabidly pro-abortion. People have even shouted at me for talking about it. When they're in the buffer zone, Nick. Yeah, the buffer zone is an absurdity. If you can't just pray in your head, and even in some cases now, Scotland have said in your own house you can't pray if it's within one of these zones or something. It's absolute madness. But the reason I bring this up is that Trump is now threatening, or the Trump administration is looking at this case and monitoring it because they're concerned about obviously free speech in Britain. And it's the reason this gets fascinating and quite bizarre, really, when you think about the US is having to do this, is that they're saying US UK relations should share a mutual respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. However, as Vice President Vance has said, we're concerned about freedom of expression in the United Kingdom. And that came from the US State Department. So essentially, they're looking at this and saying, if they're doing this kind of thing, that's a big problem for our trade. And so we've got Trump threatening these tariffs, and it looks like we probably will get tariffs because we've got VAT. Maybe with a different government, we could have got an exception to the tariffs because we are their biggest trading partner, the US. We have a good trading arrangement, very mutual. but because of these are the kind of things that are causing us trouble. As is net zero, of course, because net zero forces the US to develop more electric cars and things like this, and makes it impossible for them to compete with China. So that's a stupid thing we're doing to alienate the US. But also this, and I just saw a clip just before we started on Good Morning Britain with Susanna Reid, and she was freaking out, as was Andrew Pierce, weirdly, about the US doing this, as if they were sort of, yes, you could say it's an imposition. The US has been imposing on us since post World War II, so that's not a big change. But the way she was sort of defending it, it's like, well, we want our online safety and blah blah, and they're threatening that. It's like, well, no, they're standing up for free speech, which we should stand for. You might not like US bullying us, which is a sort of a separate, semi-separate issue, but the fact that they were defending it and their instinct was to go, how dare Trump demand that we have basic free speech and free expression in our country? It's kind of embarrassing and insane. I don't know. What do you think?
Oh man, that's multifaceted. So, couple of things going on there. Obviously, the abortion debate, which isn't actually hugely important when you talk about the arrest. What is maddening are these buffer zones. So I've had this debate as well, and I'm much more pro-abortion than you'll ever be, Nick. I sit somewhere in the middle on this, and I don't have the same issues that you do. But one thing I do have no issue with.
I don't know what my issues are. But...
No. Issues too strong a word, mate.
I mean, I am pretty pro-life. I mean, we have, what is it, 24 weeks versus Europe. I mean,
yeah,
I think we're in line with the Netherlands, but we're far more liberal than, which is always a red flag. We're far more, if you want to call it liberal or extreme, than France, Denmark, Belgium, these kind of countries. Completely, our rules are completely insane. But especially insane is the buffer zone, which is not about an abortion issue. That's a free speech issue. Should be allowed to think. Should you be allowed to? They check what you're thinking in your head if you're stood on the wrong bit of the street. That's madness. And then this case, but I don't want to get too down in the weeds about that, because what's interesting about this case is it's a similar case to the WhatsApp story. It's about when we're so anti-free speech in this country, we actually damage our relationship with America.
Yeah. So it's the buffer zone I have an issue with for all the reasons that you've said. I once had a debate on Facebook again, because that's where I meet the liberal left more often than I do on Twitter. And I don't really get too involved, but people being arrested for thinking. And the argument back is they're not being arrested for thinking, they're being arrested for breaking the law. It's like, the law's an ass.
Yeah.
Okay? So, there are things, you're able to say that to me. What about if I made a law that said you couldn't say that to me? It just ends up in a right old mess.
Yeah, it's a law that they've just come up with 10 minutes ago that's obviously nonsense.
Well, exactly. It's not exactly one of the 10 commandments, is it? So, with regards to Trump, yeah, you're right. This has been a lever that the US have been able to pull across the world for a long time, because they are a superpower now, particularly since the end of World War II. And I don't like the broad brushstrokes that Trump takes with regards to tariffs, but I understand why he does it. The reason I don't like, not because it's aimed at Britain, in fact, I think we've got much greater opportunity to negotiate with him. He's saying to us, unlike he is to the EU, he'll say to us, look, I'm going to do this unless. With the EU, it's just like, I don't like him, you're having it. And we'll talk about it later. The broad brushstrokes affect a lot of people. It's turned the debate in Canada on its head. And now Trudeau's gone and Mark Carney's in there. Mark Carney has got a very good chance of winning that election. He wouldn't have had without the tariffs that have been placed on Canada, because it's changed the debate. It's turned a lot of people who had been pro-Trump against Trump on that issue. And it also isn't good for the American markets either. And Trump must know this, because if you're just taking these tariffs to absolutely everybody, what it says internally into your markets is we're just pissing off a load of our export and importers. So the markets fluctuate quite a lot. Every time he does this, they're up and down all over the place. And of course, these levers are great politically for Trump, because he gets what he wants from Mexico. He gets what he wants from Canada, but it's the collateral damage. He's probably going to get what he wants from the UK. I don't know about the EU. He clearly is not a fan of the EU, and he doesn't like the way that they've behaved. Hopefully, our relationship, I don't know how special it is any longer. And like I think you said on Twitter, or you may have said on GBN, it's not the UK that the Trump administration dislike. It's the UK government. I just wish, like you did, sometimes they'd distinguish that in a
Yeah.
debate because
because
they don't hate us.
they got me being against Trump on this, and I'm the most pro-Trump person there's ever been. But when it comes to the tariffs, and it comes to all this kind of stuff, I don't like it. I don't like some of the stuff coming from Vance, and then they had the signal thing, which made them look silly, and Hegseth, and it sort of leaked how they feel about Europe and potentially Britain. The tariffs thing's a whole separate debate. I don't think it's been handled well. I don't understand the Canada thing where he gives Carney an easy win, as you say. We could do an episode on that. I mean, I'm skeptical about Trump's path that he's taking on that. But on the free speech issue, that one is just it's so clear that if you look at the WhatsApp case we just described, look at the buffer zone case, we're just an embarrassment on the free speech issue internationally.
Yeah. And America are turning the screw on that, and they're doing so to highlight it. Yes, it's political. It's brinkmanship to some degree, okay? We accept that. This is part and parcel of what goes on, particularly in geopolitics. However, at the essence of those political games is one country who is totally built on free speech, and another that, whilst it isn't, was the biggest purporter of it across the world for many, many decades, and should be upholding the same values. We don't have constitutions in the same way America does. However, our principles are not vastly different. And if we can't protect parents from arrest in front of their children for debating on a WhatsApp group about how a school is behaving, or sending people to prison for 3 years for inciting things, by the way, an absolute nonsense. I'm not going to chuck all the babies out with the bathwater here. There are things in there that would have got, like I said, a 6-week sentence before, a 6-month sentence maybe. People would have served weeks in prison, and that would have been enough, and it would have done the job. And maybe the guy that committed suicide would still be alive. But if it takes a Trump administration to highlight to the rest of the UK that we are under this anarcho-tyranny, then I'm all for it. Because who else is going to do it? Look around. We haven't even got people. Robert Jenrick, maybe. I'm not even convinced Nigel Farage might at the moment. So I don't know who else is going to do it. So sometimes you need a Donald Trump. And it's why a lot of us still have faith in Donald Trump, despite some of the Ukraine stuff, despite some of this tariff stuff. He is doing God's work when it comes to some of the free speech issues and DEI issues. There are people across the aisle that have just had enough, and they can see where it's going. And the fact it's made Trump the good guy should be a wake-up call to all the people that hate Trump. Not the people who support Trump, because he's also protecting them. By protecting free speech, he's protecting everybody. And I honestly, if you're out there and thinking, well, it's not my free speech, you're missing the point, you knob.
It's always good to have an attack on a total hypothetical straw man person. All right, we can't do too much more on the old YouTube. We've done an hour, so I think we'll go on to nickdixon.net. We've got to talk about Keir Starmer and the Adolescents Roundtable, which is so ridiculous and hilarious, kind of bleakly hilarious. Starmer's chatting to people about a made-up show and why we need to base our policies on that. Of course, Marine Le Pen has been stitched up by the French establishment. We'll do a little bit on that. And maybe we'll talk about Ed Davey and why he's on a pretend horse. Go to nickdixon.net for all that, plus all my interviews and all my other content and all the bonus podcasts I do with Paul on non-political matters. And I've got some very controversial interviews coming up, so you'll get them only on nickdixon.net. And we'll see you there for the full thing. Paul, at Paul Cox Comedy, where do you want to send people?
Yeah, just go to Paul Cox Comedy. Some of those controversial interviews that Nick's doing with 9-year-old girls who've got opinions about their schools, by the way. It's terrifying stuff. Do tune in.
Yeah, they're not, just for clarity. That sounded way too weird in that hypothetical.
I'm so sorry, mate.
It's all right. You made me sound like a nonce at the very end when you've mainly been talking about how nonsense throughout the show. And
oh my God!
If when we're in prison together, Paul, you can't spread that kind of rumor.
No,
I'm interviewing a 9-year-old girl. That's kind of thing was going to get me battered day one. I'll be like, Paul was making an ill-advised joke. Too late. I'm already.
Oh
I'm
my
already
God.
getting shivved with a makeshift knife that's made from a toothbrush. Anyway, nickdixon.net, and we'll see you all again. If you're listening or watching on YouTube, thank you very much. We'll see you again next week.